Now we have Professor Ewert, who is a geophysicist from the University of Paderborn, and he will address the extremely important issue of the Swindle with the anthropogenic climate change.
Meine Damen und Herren, bleiben Sie ruhig sitzen. Der Klimawandel ist auch mit einer Dreiviertelstunde Verspätung noch ein interessantes Thema.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated. The anthropogenic climate change is still an interesting theme, even after 45 minutes of delay.
Ich bedanke mich herzlich für die Einladung hier.
I thank you for the invitation that I can speak here. And I'm especially excited that there are so many young people among you, because it is about you. And you have to fight the fight against the spirit of the time. Don't hear. And there's a slogan by a certain person who says the mistake can be seen because everybody is believing in it. Maybe we can brighten this picture a little bit. Let's test it.
Die Klimainstitutionen geben, wie gesagt, Berichte raus und dann Kurzberichte für Politiker. Und wenn Politiker so eine Grafik sehen mit der Klimaentwicklung, mit der Temperaturentwicklung, dann bekommen sie verständlicherweise Angst. Denn sie sehen ja, dass das hier so ab 1960, 1970 sehr steil hochgeht. Ich komme auf diesen Punkt ziemlich zum Schluss zurück. Behalten Sie ihn bitte im Gedächtnis, er ist ganz wichtig. Klima, ich will noch ganz kurz zu mir sagen, ich bin Geologe und habe in meinem Berufsleben etwas ganz anderes gemacht. Hatte eine Professur für Geotechnik und habe mich mit dem Klimawandel erst in den letzten Jahren beschäftigt, und zwar deshalb, weil ich mich gefragt habe als Geologe, was erzählen die ständig über diesen Klimawandel? Das ist doch nichts Besonderes. Den Klimawandel hat es immer gegeben. Die Temperaturen auf der Erde waren nur vorübergehend gleich und meistens haben sie sich nach kurzer Zeit geändert. Das hat ganz viele Ursachen, dass sich das ändert. Die kann ich Ihnen hier nicht vortragen, in der Kürze der Zeit sowieso nicht. Ich will nur auf eine Gruppe der Ursachen aufmerksam machen. Und das sind die variierenden Bahnparameter. Sie wissen, die Erde bewegt sich um die Sonne auf einer Ellipse und die Radien dieser Ellipse und die Drehachse der Erde in Relation zu dieser Ellipse, die ändern sich ständig.
So the axis of the Earth, the rotation of the Earth around the Sun is an ellipse and it keeps changing. So the eccentricity is changing, and also the tilt of the Earth, which is 23.5 degrees, is also changing, and this gives weather changes. And you also all know that we have had ice ages. And the ice ages have reached far more south than we are being used to in the last period. And then we have this picture. Looks a bit weird, but it tells us something. This is the size of the Caspian Sea, and it's changed in the last 500 years. And this tells us that the rainfall in this region has been changing very much in the last 500 years. And there's a connection to the Black Sea and also to the Aral Sea. And this change has been like that since 500 million years. And nobody can say that there was climate change at that time because it wasn't there. What we see here is the climate deviation for 500,000 years. In the upper graph and the lower graph is the climate changes in the last 9,000 years. These are remarkable. If we look at the recent climate change, this you see here, A red curve is the differing impinging of the sun, and the blue line is the temperature. So the strength of the rays of the sun is directly related to the temperature on Earth. So those people who say that we are guilty, human beings are guilty of temperature, is not true. You see this in this graph. And in the lower graph, you see that the human-made carbon dioxide production has only been very sharply increasing in the last period. But the change came already before. So the recent climate change, whatever they talk about, cannot be brought into relation of more CO2 production of human beings in the last 20, 40 years. These are natural causes. Now we have a proof that our CO2 has nothing to do with climate change. These are only scenarios. You know about the World Climate Council, the International Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. I won't go into all the details, I just give you one example. I give you the example of the Caspian Sea, because I just used this. 1995, they told us they published a scenario according to which the level of the sea should be rising until 2010. The opposite is the case. It has been falling about 20 centimeters. So their forecasts have their problems. And there's one explanation for this. A Spanish philosopher once said, practice without theory is routine, but theory without practice is illusion. And this is what's the case here. Now, let's look at the data. I'm not a climatologist, and I'm not a climate researcher or scientist. I'm looking at myself as the child in Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. I'm looking if the emperor has some clothes, and I see he doesn't have any. So, if you look at the data that we have, if you look, this one graph here is from the Goddard Institute for Space Society. This is the mean average temperature of the Earth. And the question is there a climate change or not? And if you look at the steep change here, this graph, it seems to look like it. But I want to notify you that on the temperature scale, we have a variation of 1.4 degrees Celsius. And this is 150 years of data. So now you can ask yourself, because it is known that climate change takes a long period, why did the IPCC not use older data? Because the data is there. This is from a working group of the IPCC, which is an older data. And this is the temperature change between 1765 and 2100. And you see they don't have any data before 1765, but all the more data for the future. And you don't really know what to believe. There was a Chinese philosopher he said, a person who knows something doesn't make forecasts, and who makes forecasts does not know. This is another chart. This is from an internet portal. This is a weather center, the Little Ice Age thermofrost. You can see here where the weather stations are. The most are in Europe, but we have a few in Australia, in America, in Asia, and a relatively few in South America or Africa. I have to hurry a little bit because I don't have so much time, but we're going to make it. What are the preconditions? The preconditions are the upper graph here. This is the strength of the sun rays, and you see how it changed. Until 1700 it was relatively low, then it increased, then it decreased, and it increased a little bit. And in this period you had the small ice age, which wasn't very nice on Earth. And if you look at the temperatures beginning in 1900, looking a little bit back, you also see the much higher temperatures in Greenland, where we had farming in Greenland. And then you see the ice age. This is the lower graph now. So the temperature change is according to the sun's activity. So these are long-time temperature cycles. The upper one is the oldest one we have on Earth. It starts 1659, and this is for England. And the lower one is Berlin. And I want to notify you that over 3 centuries there have always been periodic temperature changes, but nothing remarkable. Especially in the recent period, we don't have so much remarkable changes. We have the so-called heat end effect, which I will have to explain later. I will. But first, where do you get such a curve from? You go to the internet, you get the data. This is, for example, a weather station in Holland, and they record the average mean monthly temperature. This is for 2008 and also 2009. You take an Excel program and then you just create such a curve. And then you see, it goes upward. And we have this amount of time in 100 years. And it became warmer about 0.8 degrees Celsius. But this also has to do with this little ice age. But you also have to dissect this curve a little bit. It becomes a little colder, a little bit warmer, a little colder, warmer, and so forth and so on. So if you analyze these things, you have to see the total change, but you also have to look at the partial change. And then you notice that we have cooling and we have warming. The upper curve, you don't have any real mean change. In Berlin is the lower one. We have a little bit change. And in Stockholm is 0.7 degrees Celsius in 100 years. And we don't only have warmings in those periods, but also coolings. And that means that a small ice age is not finished in all the regions of Earth. Otherwise, we wouldn't have those coolings. We have such coolings, for example, in New Zealand. Or Chicago, Iceland. You have remarkable coolings going on. So this is the so-called heat island effect. which you see nicely portrayed here. The lower graph is the US Military Academy in West Point. That's the station, close to New York. This is a small city station. So, beginning 1900, there's no real change. It has stayed about the same. And in New York has also been the same. And then it became warmer. And this is because there were city building in New York. They started building skyscrapers, and this changes microclimate. And this is the so-called heat island effect, urban island effect, they call it in English. UAE. And here you see the same thing for city development in New York. First it was cooler in New York, and then when city development started, it became warmer. In Tokyo, this started about 1930. In Japan, about 20 years later. So, if you look at the heat development, you can also see the city development. But also, this graph shows something strange. In Chicago, temperatures went down. And Chicago is one of the most architectural cities. So you would assume it would go up. But it's about the Michigan Lake. And Lake Michigan acts like a refrigerator. And that determines the temperature. The urban island effect also affects our conclusions about all this. On the upper graph you see Vienna, and in the last decades you see the urban island effect. You have a warming of 0.3 degrees Celsius in 100 years. If you only look up until 1970, it would only be 0.01 degrees Celsius. So if you interpret these data, you have to really take this urban island effect into account. And as another example here, the official curve of the German Weather Service for Germany. You see the mean average temperature of 1998 until 2009. You see that there's a cooling in 180 years. Sorry, it's from 1891 until 2009. And you see a small cooling. If you dissect this and make some quantitative qualifications of this, then you see it cooled, it warmed, it cooled, it warmed. And this warming here took place from 1976 to 2000, and this is according to the sun's activity. I will come back to this one. You can't look at this in details, it's too complex, but I want to show you the following. This is a part of the 82 weather stations that I chose, and you can see that there's always change, and there's different change in different regions. Neighboring regions are sometimes equal, sometimes they differ. It's a very interesting story. What's especially important is in this period you see the brown colors is warming, and if you look at this one you see at 1910 up until about 1950 you have a steady warming, and then you have a blue band, and blue means cooling. And cooling starts about the period that we started to produce our CO2, and that really doesn't fit together. This is not supposed to be like that. So what do we have? The urban island effect is not taken out of this chart. So about 77%, these are the yellow colors. So we have a warming of about 0.6 degrees Celsius in 100 years, which is not exactly a lot. But you also have regions that stayed cool. This is the lesser percentage of the weather stations. And you had a cooling of about 0.2 degrees Celsius. And if you look at all those changes, it changes from 1659 until 2008, we can conclude that we have warmings in a low range, but we also have coolings, also in a pretty small range. And I have to notify you that starting 1945 until 76, we had a cooling period. There was a global cooling period in this time. And this is important because the World Meteorology Organization defined climate as the average weather, average temperature in 30 years. And since you have a global cooling cycle in these 30 years, you would have to wait another 30 years if the next period is also a cooling period or not. But this is not what they did. In a few years, they already extrapolated all the data and said we have a global warming period. Part of this campaign were the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the German newspaper. They had an ad, cited the American Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he said, we're getting a new global ice age. And 1 year later, we're going to have a warming, excuse me. And both said human beings are guilty of this. But we don't have global climate change, we have small global temperature changes. If you take the difference between Berlin and Frankfurt, mean temperature difference between these two cities is 0.8 degrees Celsius. So you can say Berlin and Frankfurt, the climate is approximately the same. At least there's not major differences. And if you go to Milan, that's obviously a much different climate. What I want to say with this is if you want to look at climate change, you cannot look at 0 point something degrees, you need at least a few degrees, full degrees. Now I come to a sensitive point. This is the global warming effect. This effect is very provocative in scientific circles. So now we're talking here about the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is very much debated among scientists. And the most important greenhouse gas is not CO2, it is water. And if you look at the facts, the features, and the creation of CO2, you'll see. If different newspapers, Spiegel, Stern, others, want to tell us how crazy and dangerous CO2 is, they show us these steaming, they show us these white steam coming out of factories, and people think, oh my God, this is dangerous. But I tell you, this white gas, steam, this is water vapor, and this is not poisonous. We are telling our kids in school and say CO2 is unhealthy, and this is a crime to our youth. because CO2 is the main building element of life. Even we consist of 9% carbon. We exhale it, plants are made of it, and to say that CO2 is dangerous and unhealthy is criminal. So CO2 is an element of life. You know the process of photosynthesis. Oxygen is created out of carbon dioxide, and the plant builds a type of sugar. So carbon dioxide is a beginning starting element of the life chain. And anybody who has actually been in a greenhouse will see that the plants in the greenhouse are being gassed with CO2 so that they grow quicker. So if we look at this graph, you see that CO2 has been constant for 2,000 years. The red line is CO2, supposed to be constant for 2,000 years, and then it goes up. And if you looked at Al Gore's movie, then he goes one step of the ladder up, so that he can show where the graph is now. Why is this the case? Because the IPCC does not consider the chemically considered CO2 contents of the Earth. Why do they say that? Otherwise, they wouldn't have this result. They would have something totally different. If you look at Hans-Georg Beck, he published a work in 2007, and he looked at the chemically determined CO2 contents of the air. And I think he took about 90,000 different papers and almost more single data. We can determine CO2 content of the Earth since 1810 in a chemical analytical way, and Mr. Beck has been interpreting this, and he found out that the average was much higher in 1830, 1840. You see this in the upper graph, and then it went down again. And what you also see, there is no relation between CO2 and the temperature. This picture should just show you that there is a cycle. You have photosynthesis with the soil on the left side, and on the right side you have the water cycle. If you look at the quantities involved here, you'll see that 44% of the CO2 is bound in the water. Some in the soil, there's 23%. And human beings and animals all together are 6.5%. And our production, coal, other things, is 2.6% in total. And now you have to think about something. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is 0.038%. 95% of this small percentage is according to nature, which means that is 0.0361%. And man only produces 5% of this 0.0361%. So that is 0.0018% for Germany. So if we would stop carbon dioxide production in Germany, then we would have a change of temperature by 0.002. You cannot feel this, you cannot measure this. You all remember the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and you also might remember the hacker attack in the central computer of the climate research unit at the university in Norwich. And they stole 61 megabyte of data. And the climate realists analyzed these emails and the data. And a few days later, the New York Times on a Sunday had the headline, Climate Gate. And the older people among you will know what this means. Manipulation of data. And I just take one segment of this. There are two American independent meteorologists, Anthony Watts and Galileo. They have published this paper here in January 2010, politically caused deception, politically driven deception. They found out that this institute got all the data, but they didn't take all the data. They didn't use all of them. If you look at the lower graph, you will see the temperatures, and then you see the amount of stations in the world. And the amount of stations decreased because some were wrong. But beginning 1990, they shut down. They just took out stations. Of 6,000 stations, they only took 1,500. And you see, they only took those stations that are in cities, and those which are in colder regions and in higher regions. So this is what they took. They took those out, the cooler regions. So it's a statistical trick. So here's something from NASA. There's a link here. If you click on a country, you get a list of stations. And if I click on a certain region, you get all the weather stations located there. You get Minsk, Brest. And if you click on one station, I did it with Minus down there, where the red arrow is, and then you get the temperature line, so-called. And you get the whole mean temperature of that time. And then you can see what actually happened here. In this case, we can say nothing special. It always deviated.
Habe ich davon 775 oder 76 Stationen für die ganze Welt ausgewertet und habe sie klassifiziert, einmal in Erwärmung. Wo haben wir eine Erwärmung?
So I took 750 stations and look where do we have cooling and where do you have warming.
Hätten wir hier eine Erwärmung in Folge Stadtentwicklung, das ist Elobeit, die Erwärmung ist Elobeit im Sudan. U ist die Erwärmung in Folge Stadtentwicklung, das ist hier Rio de Janeiro. Hier bis dahin konstant, dann wurde die Stadt stärker gebaut, dann ist sie wärmer geworden.
U, right upper side, is Rio de Janeiro, and you have a warming effect because of city development. And then you have Chad, which is getting cooler, which should have been warmer because of CO2 production, but didn't do. And then you have Kapstadt, and it stayed about the same. And here I looked at different parameters, and you see that the solar density So you get all those curves of, this is just examples of these different 750 weather stations. And if you try to look, where do you find an influence of CO2? And you have to recognize there is none. It doesn't exist. I did the same thing with temperature again. You see there's a warm band until 1940 on the left side. Then you get the blue band, which is the cooling period, and then you get the warming period again. But this is the solar activity cycle. If you do that for the whole Earth, which I did in these charts here, you get the result that there is in 75% of all stations, the temperatures either stay the same or has actually become cooler. That is the result. So there's also independent people from the IPCC. This is Australia. You see it goes down according to the sun cycle, and it goes up again. This is the USA. It's in principle the same. You see that the temperature goes along pretty nicely with the solar cycle. And you all know this, that the sentence that without CO2 reduction we will have several degree warming until 2010. This is the IPCC slogan. But this is not true. You have different forecasts, and nature refutes this forecast. In 70% of all cases, as I already indicated earlier, we have a cooling in the last decades. And this cooling we have since 2000 years, but the CO2 content of the atmosphere increases. Well, why does this happen? The oceans were a little bit warmer, they released more CO2. Why? I don't know. But now I come back to the beginning. You remember this curve where we had the steep increase, where politicians get very nervous. And you have the anthropogenic CO2. And if you look at this graph, and I want to tell you the y-axis is only 1.4 degrees, and here it's 2 degrees. If you change the metric and put one graph into the other, then this steep change, you don't even see it anymore in this other graph. You have nothing which we wouldn't have already had in the earlier times, in the pre-industrial age. Here you see it in a very concrete example. You see there's a warming in the pre-industrial age, and after you don't see a change. Temperature correlates with the sun's activity, but not with production and usage of oil and gas. So environmental protection is necessary, but they use climate protection. They didn't take into account all temperatures. We have the dogma of the United Nations that man is the cause. We have a very expensive climate bureaucracy. We have a very expensive climate change tourism. We have scenarios of global warming, our CO2. These are not true. Climate gate is deceiving people for cooling, and we're making political measures which are for phantom phenomena. They don't exist. The fact is, we have a warming after the small ice age, but we don't have a global climate change. We have very normal temperature changes, and we have warming and cooling in parallel. CO2 influence is not provable. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.